live.
Do you see it? Cool.
Awesome.
Hey guys, welcome. We're going to have our second installment of debates. The last time was about rent being theft or not, and now we're moving on to another question about the nature and scope of self-defense, essentially. And so the question that originally started kind of from this Charlottesville conversation that we've been having, and this idea of punching a Nazi, and there's a deeper philosophical question that comes with that encompasses beyond just this Charlottesville situation, but that's, I think, what got a lot of people's wheels to turning. And so we're here with Arias and Matt Kuehnel, and so they're going to present their sides of this conversation, of this debate, and hopefully we'll be able to learn something from these folks. So if you guys would like to go ahead and start kind of talking about your position, that would be fantastic. So who would like to go first? I should probably pick somebody, but
well, typically Matt would be going first.
Yeah, I'm going to go first. So my argument is going to be as a libertarian. As a libertarian, I'm not concerned with what the laws say. I concern myself with the morality of actions within the context of the non-aggression principle. I am committed to the maxim that it is unethical to initiate aggression to achieve personal or political goals. That's a heavy moral commitment, and as with any moral principle, there are good faith debates on what constitutes violations. Individuals can have varying degrees of disagreements on what constitutes the initiation of aggression and what limits the reasonable defensive force that we can use. We may not see eye to eye completely, but you'll at least find that my views are based on my love and adherence to that pledge that I signed becoming a Libertarian Party member. These are my personal beliefs. I'm not qualified to run your life, to craft your beliefs, or to speak on behalf of anyone other than myself. And these views aren't popular, maybe outside of the Black Flag Caucus. But otherwise, I do believe that all statists, those that support state violence, are guilty of violating the non-aggression principle. And they do bear some measure of responsibility for the coercion and violence carried out by the state structure. The first step to liberty is really recognizing we all bear some responsibility for the force initiated by government. Now, regarding the issue of punching a Nazi, the speech, as far as I'm concerned, I'm not going to make the positive argument that one ought to punch a Nazi, though it would be incredibly enjoyable to do so, but rather that Nazis and those individuals who publicly display their allegiance to ethno-nationalism present such a threat that punching them is justifiable within the confines of the non-aggression principle. Nazis use their speech to deceive and manipulate others to carry out violence. This is coercion. The speakers at these events, Spencer, Cantwell, Invictus, and other repugnant skid marks are really the perpetrators of violence. These weak-willed and spineless windbags display their mush-brained minions to do the violence. This manipulation of others to do their bidding renders the leaders of these sickening movements answerable to a greater amount of violence. We recognize there is little evidence Hitler himself killed anyone. After all, he started out a leader of about 50 World War I vets. In manipulating others by offering supremacy over others, by fear-mongering, by scapegoating, and by normalizing aggression against Jews, he was responsible for millions of deaths. But we don't even have to look at Hitler for an example of weaponized speech. Think of Charles Manson. He was never the actor in murders, but he was directly responsible for the death of 7 individuals. We can make these clear distinctions between offensive speech and coercion. Such coercion, particularly when initiated by fucking Nazis, ought to be met with defensive force. Punch, not maiming, not murdering. Is that defensive force? I believe so. And it also serves as a challenge to the ideas of Nazis. Frankly, if they can't take a punch, they're not part of a master race. It's an immediate deterrent from being a Nazi in public, and it exposes these individuals as feeble and as insecure creatures whose only skill is manipulating men with smaller minds to enact violence. If we can't say they are responsible for those crimes those men commit, we can at least say they are guilty of using deception and coercion in the same way a predatory military recruiter targets teenagers. If I'm on the jury for someone who happened to clock Augustus Invictus, a liar, a manipulator who pretended to be a libertarian to take advantage of our infrastructure, who advocated eugenics and fascism, who is now a Republican given the Roman salute, and most importantly, it appears he's a fucking Nazi, I'm voting not guilty every time. It's justified to make Nazis look weak. It is justified defensive force to illustrate that these people are not supreme, they are not brave, and they are not welcome.
Thanks, Matt. And Aria?
Was that your beginning, or was that just you introducing your basic position?
That was my argument for basing speech on coercion.
Okay. Well, then my cross-examining, the first thing I noticed was that you alleged that all statists are violent. I agree with that. I just wanted to point that out. You also explicitly said that offensive speech must be met with defensive force. I mean, is that something you really want to stick with? That offensive speech must be met with defensive force?
I'm making the distinction that is not offensive. It's one thing to say, Germans have big noses. That may be offensive. That's not a threat. I'm saying it's different when it's a threat, when they are actively trying to recruit people to organize against other people.
But what they're essentially doing is talking. You said coercion repeatedly during that. Coercion has a clear definition involving force and violence itself. Manipulating people, however messed up it may be, is not coercion, it's manipulation. That's why we have two words for it. You accuse them of coercion, but that implies they're using force or violence in order to elicit fear in people, which is essentially exactly what you said you wanted to do, because you said violence is a deterrent to being a Nazi. So it seems to me that you're the one guilty of coercion here. You want to deter them from even being Nazis, even though they haven't. I mean, what's the connection between their speech and actual violence? I mean, yes, we do have the one protester who ran over someone. There's violence on all sides, no doubt. But I mean, the vast majority of them were just saying stupid shit.
It's stupid shit that gets people killed, and really, that if anything, you can say that they are the ones being manipulated. A lot of them may be the ones that are being manipulated. However, the people that are spreading that ideology, that are going out in public and displaying Nazi propaganda, they're participating in malicious dishonesty, and that is definitely a form of coercion. We recognize all the time that there are nonviolent forms of coercion.
It's dishonesty, it's manipulation, sure, but it's not coercion. I mean, coercion, especially in regard to the NAP, it has a clear meaning and a clear definition. You can't just say, oh, well, he manipulated someone into doing that, he coerced them into it. It doesn't work that way. It means you were forced against your will.
It's an intentional or negligent use of some action. I mean, it's generally violent. It's generally threatening, but it can also be deceptive. To manipulate a person's condition is to enact coercion.
No, it's not. I mean, coercion is going around and hitting somebody saying, if you don't agree with what I agree, then I'm going to beat you up. But we're going to shut down your free speech with violence to deter you from being a Nazi. That's deterrent. Going around saying, hell, Hitler, it's stupid, but it's not a deterrent. It's not coercion. It's not weaponized speech. And what would you say is weaponized speech? Because there are several different tiers of expressing any wish. Say, I want to kill all Jews. That sucks and it's messed up. But it's a very different thing from saying, I'm going to go kill a Jew. Intent matters. Circumstances matter. Like, what is his name? I don't remember his name, but there's some white supremacist who's in prison right now. He wants to kill all the Jews. He wants to kill all the black people. And he means it when he says it. Should we act in self-defense and go ahead and kill him? No, he's in prison. He can't enact that threat, even if he wants to. So it's not just a matter of, oh no, they said a threat, therefore our defense is justified. They also have to be capable of actually going through with that threat, and they have to intend to go through with that threat. The vast majority of those idiots didn't.
All right. So Aria, so I think that should be about time for your cross-examination. Do you want to go ahead and give your position?
Yeah.
Cool.
So it goes without saying that an individual has the right to defend themselves against an attack. I mean, that goes all the way back. It has nothing to do with law, going back to common law, even back to the Code of Hammurabi. We have it written into our society itself that we have the right to defend ourselves against attack. But what is self-defense? Because that's the topic here, not whether one is allowed to use violence against violence. We all know we are. But what is it? What is its scope and what are its limitations? These are important questions. Because as I started to say during the examination, what if Bob says, I wish you were dead? Is that a threat? Am I justified in killing him now because he said he wishes I was dead? Absolutely not. What if he took it a step further and said, I want you dead? Is that a threat? Absolutely not. What if he goes even further and says, I'm going to kill you? Well, then we start getting into the territory where something is considered a legitimate and credible threat. But it depends. Does he actually mean it? Because we've all said at one point in our lives, I'm sure we have, we've jokingly said to a friend, haha, I'm going to slap you, or man, I'm going to kill you if you say that again. But we didn't mean it. But if we go by that mentality that every threat is legitimate and can be enacted with self-defense, no matter how far-fetched it is, then we can be killed for telling our friends, I'm going to slap you. We can get beaten down with hammers for telling our friends that we're going to slap you. And it's more insidious than that, because the entire self-defense argument means that the other person, the initiator of the violence, is guilty of a crime. They're guilty of the act of aggression, the crime of aggression. That's what has always been the standard when determining whether or not something is considered self-defense. If the other person is committing a crime, violence, then it's self-defense. If they're not, then it's not self-defense. So you're saying, let's say I'm going on trial or whatever, a civilian court, peasant court, doesn't matter. And I'm saying that I defended myself against Bob. Fair enough. Except Bob is also innocent until proven guilty. And this is true for the Nazis as well. They're innocent until proven guilty. We can't just say, oh, well, he's a Nazi, therefore he's guilty of violence, so I'm going to be judge, jury, and executioner and inflict violence upon him. That's vigilantism. It's not anarchism. It's not libertarianism. It's just, I'm going to be my own state. It's not eliminating the state. It's turning everyone into a state, advocating state violence. Because I'm not Bob's judge, jury, and executioner. And just as I have the right to be considered not guilty until I'm proven guilty, so does Bob. So we have to assume that both of us are guilty until proven innocent until proven guilty. But what about North Korea? North Korea makes threats against Guam. They just made one saying that they wanted to hit Guam with missiles or something like that. Well, we're contractually obligated to protect Guam. Should we take that threat seriously? Of course not. Because one, he doesn't have the intent. He's just talking shit. Are we going to kill everyone who ever makes a threat, no matter how empty it is and no matter whether or not they're capable of doing it? We have these criteria that we use to determine whether or not something is self-defense. And it depends entirely upon whether or not the other person is guilty of a crime. You can't just assume they did. You can't just take the law into your own hands. You can't just take civilian customs into your own hand if you don't like the word law. You can't just flaunt all social conventions and say, you know what, I'm Judge Dredd. I think he's violent. I'm going to kill him. It doesn't work that way. Because it's an action that determines criminal behavior. It's not words. It's action. It is not that the criminal wants to kill someone. It's that the criminal plans to kill someone. And it falls upon me as the person acting in self-defense to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the person I defended myself against had intent, because that person, whatever immoral thing they wanted to do, and no matter what immoral thing they said, they have to be presumed innocent until they've been proven guilty. I'll cut it there.
Cool, thank you. Matt, do you have a cross-examination?
Yeah. So one, you mentioned somebody's got to mean the threat, and I can't imagine that you believe that most of these Nazis would not be enacting on that threat should they have the chance.
Well, let me counter that with a question. All of these people saying they wanted to punch Nazis. How many of them are doing it? Maybe 1%.
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. No,
they wanted to punch a Nazi, be arrested for inciting violence? If not, why should the Nazis be arrested? I would say that no greater than 1% of them would ever actually act on it. The vast majority of them are just stupid idiots.
I think the vast majority of them are hoping other people will do the violence for them. I agree that they are weak and they probably won't do it. And I agree that, you know what, I'm not going out looking for Nazis to punch, but I believe it's just in the right to do that. I think it's a ethical stance. As far as
that's exactly what you're saying of them, though. You're saying that you're hoping that somebody else will go out and inflict the violence that they're calling for, and you're calling for violence and saying that you're hoping that somebody will go out and inflict the violence that you're calling for.
But there's a big difference between calling for genocide, for you know, an ethnic cleansing, and a punch. I mean, a punch is not calling for death. It's not judge, jury, and executioner, because it's just a punch.
Are you not calling for ethnic genocide of Nazis?
Ethnic genocide of Nazis?
Didn't you say that you wanted to deter people from being Nazis by using violence? You want to beat people until there are no more Nazis?
Wouldn't you feel the same about murderers? I mean, don't you want to deter murderers?
I have complex views on justice that aren't entirely related to this. We reward good behavior. We don't punish bad behavior. That's how we create a better society.
And maybe, because I don't know, because I feel like that's where there's a lot of disconnection, is that we're basing a lot of this off of our laws. And these laws, I think, are man-made. I think they're often used against us rather than for us. And I feel like this is one of those cases where it may be in somebody's best interest to oppose this however they see fit, but the government is actually the one blocking it, saying it's just speech. They're making that determination for them.
Well, I've been an anarchist for years. I agree with you entirely. The law it's only useful when we want it to be. I mean, really, and it's usually not. It's just a bunch of bullshit that they made up to keep us alive for the most part. But what the law says about it doesn't really matter. They're not, I mean, saying you wish for something to happen is very different from doing it. I mean, even if I was screwed up enough to say, you know, I wish all the Jews were dead, which I'm not, but even if I was, that's a very different thing from, you know, orchestrating plans to exterminate the Jews. I mean, what you're talking about is thought crime, that because I have this desire, I'm an immoral person and therefore should be subjected to violence, whether or not I ever intend to act on that desire.
I think, again, I think it's an ethical use of force, a punch. It's not extreme. I'm not calling for vigilante groups to go out and hang them. You know, that's obviously overkill, and I think we recognize that overkill. But I think a punch is reasonable. A punch is a challenge. It's saying, you know what you're saying is threatening me as an individual, and I'm going to challenge you on that.
No, you can't do that. You can't say you're issuing a challenge in self-defense. You can't.
To a threat. They're threatening violence, and why would you not challenge them on that?
Well, they're not threatening violence. They're talking shit. That's the whole point.
So isn't that kind of a rule of thumb? Don't talk shit if you don't want to get hit. I mean, that's just common courtesy in life. You know what I mean? You don't be an asshole to people. And I think you know what, if I'm walking around in people's faces,
violence is a fundamental violation of the NAP. Agree?
I believe it is a coercive act to try to breed a nationalism like that that depends on the ethnic cleansing, the euthanasia of disabled people, that is a very real threat, a very dangerous thought, and it can't be taken lightly. If they are taking it lightly, they need to realize the seriousness of it.
If they had any chance whatsoever of success, I would agree with you, but they don't. It's Kim Jong-un talking about wanting to nuke the United States. It's Ahmadinejad talking about how he wants to wipe Israel off the map. It's just empty talk. Even if they do want to, they don't have the capabilities, and they're never going to get the capabilities because we resist it socially. I mean, you're not even allowed to be racist, much less a white supremacist, much less a white nationalist. We're never going to let someone of that degree anywhere near power. If it was ever going to be a real threat, then sure, absolutely. But as it is now, I mean, what were there? Months of planning and they got less than 1,000 people there and there were 4 times as many protesters. These aren't people we have to worry about.
I believe they are. So I'm going to go ahead and say that I believe they are threats. They do occupy positions of power. They seek positions of power. They do it undercover. They don't like to be seen. They don't like to be known that they're Nazi. They often disguise themselves with different labels, with different names for themselves. They come up with these different clubs and different overt ways of saying basically the same thing they're saying, but it's done in disguise. It's done as a facade. So for you to have one to come out directly in public and say that I am 100% a Nazi, here's my salute. You're obviously transcribing to all those ideals that go along with Nazism, and
but you have an individual there who is using power to oppress others. You don't have an individual out in the street who is powerless, who is calling for that. At that point, you have an actual individual with power who is using that to brutalize other people. But that's an issue with the state.
I don't believe it. I don't believe it is an issue with the state, and that's the point of the First Amendment: is free speech.
Statism is violence.
Statism is violence, but that's why I say I do not want the state to regulate speech. This is not something where I think there needs to be hate laws, hate speech laws. This is something where I think it is a personal responsibility, and one totally has the free will to stay home and not go to these things and not oppose them. You have that free will, but I believe you also have a free will to confront them.
There's a difference between, I don't know, Trent Lott coming out as a white supremacist when he actually has power over people and he's got the power of the state behind him. There's a vast difference between that and some slack-jawed idiot marching in Charlottesville. There's an enormous difference. One has power, one doesn't. But we should oppose Trent Lott not because he's a white nationalist with power, but because he's part of the state with power. And the state always uses that to oppress somebody. I don't really care who the victim is. They shouldn't be doing it. But that's an entirely separate issue.
But that is their entire threat, is that they are recruiting. They are trying to get their voice and their ideals spread. And you look at people that like Chris Cantwell, where he got brushed under the rug for so long. He was actually accepted into the libertarian community for a long time. And it wasn't till later where now people are seeing him at this rally going, okay, that might have been a bad association. We probably should have done something about it. And I feel like that's exactly the way the threat of Nazism. And again, I'm not saying they should have punched Chris Cantwell, but I'm saying they recognize now that what he was selling was toxic. So I think
Free Talk Live kicked him off years ago. Will kicked him off and stopped associating with him a long time ago.
Oh yeah, no, but there was still a pretty big following, a pretty big protection of him.
But not millions.
Not among capital L libertarians. But he's still got a pretty decent following of people who claim to be libertarians. And but my point with that is that that's the way that they get power, is that they look innocent. They take advantage of laws. They take advantage of parties. They'll adopt whatever party platform they have to adopt in order to spread that hate and to get that scapegoating going, make somebody the enemy, make state the answer for it. And that's a very dangerous ideal. So again, I'm not saying that punching is the only way. I'm just saying that when they are entering into that kind of coercive activity, they are putting you in a coercive environment that you cannot back out of. You are now in danger of that person spreading their ideals and getting other people to enact violence for them. So you have the right to oppose it. And like I said, it may not be the smartest way, and you're going to be taking a risk legally, because you are right. Legally, they have not done anything wrong. So you run the risk of going to jail, going to court over it. But again, if I'm on that jury and somebody's in there for punching a Nazi, not guilty. I don't see that as an unethical use of force.
So, Matt, it's probably, you've kind of ran into time for your affirmative rebuttal. So if you want to start transitioning into that.
Yeah, I mean, I was starting to get into it basically, but yeah, and that's what I base this off of is levels of threat and levels of defense. It's that they are through, and again, this is not like a definition I'm pulling out of nowhere. Even Mice's wiki page says the non-aggression principle is an ethical stance which asserts aggression is inherently illegitimate. Aggression is defined as the initiation of physical force against persons or property, threat of such, or fraud upon persons or their property. So we recognize that it does not need to be violent.
Right. We need to take a break before we do that, so that, yeah.
Oh, right on.
We have Will down here.
All right, so yeah, so we can let's pause over and let's switch over to Will here. Let's see here. All right.
I just wanted to give you guys a quick update on what's going on with the Malik Center. So far, we've raised about $5,000, which, alhamdulillah, that's really good. The fundraiser stalled out for a few days, but in the course of the last 12 to 24 hours, we've raised almost another $1,000. The media has been very happy with and talking about what we're trying to do in Keene. We've had really great response from local Muslims in Keene who are really happy to hear that, a mosque they've been trying to open for almost 5 years now with no luck, they will finally literally just have it kind of dropped in their town. As I said before, we found out that we're actually going to be about 5 miles from Chris Cantwell's house, so that's another positive I think is kind of amusing. We're coming to you guys. It's the time of Dhul Hijjah. It's the time of the Hajj right now, and it is a time like Ramadan, a time of giving when the blessing is multiplied for those things that you give. And I just wanted to remind folks out there, when you give to the Malik Center, what you're giving to is more than just giving to a mosque and the prayer, the blessing that comes along from every single prayer that is offered in that space. The blessings that you receive for that. You're also giving to an effort to help and assist local homeless, because part of the very first phase of opening this building is something for a homeless warming shelter for people to come, warm up during the frigid cold times of the day, get hot coffee, get a cup of hot tea, print out resumes. So you're not only giving just to the masjid, you're giving to an already put together and organized effort to assist local homeless in that area. And you're also giving to an interfaith effort where we'll be offering our worship space to the local Quaker community so far. But I believe there's 2 other groups that are going to want to use our worship space when the Muslim community is not using it. So you're giving first to the masjid and all the blessing that comes from all the prayers that are offered in that place, all the teaching that is done, all the dawah that is given from that masjid. The blessings and the barakah for that is for you and multiplied for those that give to this effort. But also, like I said, a Feed the Homeless effort and an interfaith community effort to bring people of this community of multiple faiths together under one roof in order to grow and foster better relationships between these communities, and hope that Keene can be an example for the rest of the country to follow and allow the Malik Center to be that example. So I ask, please click the link above the video, give $5, man. $5. Give up 1 cup of Starbucks coffee this week. Drop us $5. Help us get closer. We need to raise about $8,000 more to get the whole first phase done. That's move-in, signs, sound system, a pulpit, new carpets, and all the equipment necessary to set up this homeless warming station where we'll be giving away free coffee and hot chocolate and hot teas to help the homeless warm up during the frigid winters there. Inshallah, we also hope to expand that to a summer program where we give away free cold water, maybe lemonade, or I don't know. It's still in the planning stages. Summer's not, for quite a while, next year. But please click the link, give a few bucks, remember the blessing in it, especially in this time of the year. And inshallah, we'll see you guys in New Hampshire on September the 14th. And the Malik Center will be open, inshallah, on October the 6th with Jummah on that Friday afternoon. And then a big dinner that the entire community in the Keene, New Hampshire area will be invited to that evening, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair for your effort and your donations beforehand. And thank you again for all the help and all of your continued support.
Be back. When I could double check here. All right. Yeah, perfect. So we're back on now. So if you guys want to, Matt, if you want to continue with your affirmative rebuttal, that would be fantastic.
Yeah. So yeah, I was kind of getting into just that principle of non-aggression. That aggression doesn't necessarily have to be physical force, though it is the most extreme way of aggressing on somebody. We do recognize threat of such and fraud. So to me, I don't think it's even arguable that they're violating the non-aggression principle. They are putting people into a coercive relationship, one that they cannot escape from without using some form of dissociation. But even then, dissociation, that's not always possible. So the moving, it's basically the argument of move to Somalia. It's a threat. How we assess that, we can all look at it differently. Nobody has to even feel that it's a threat. But if you do, you have some level of defense to it. And that's why I say we can call it violence, because it is violence to punch a Nazi. But I feel like it's not the most egregious form of violence. It is more of a statement. It's a violent statement, but it is a statement. It's something that an individual is going to do, and there's going to be accountability. Like I said, that there's accountability both for the speech and for the act of defending yourself. Society is going to judge you. Currently, that is through law, and the law may see fit that you actually committed the assault. Maybe they don't see that. In an anarchist society, whatever structure you have in your community, and maybe you are in a community by yourself, so you have nobody to answer to but yourself. Otherwise, if you're in a community, you're going to have neighbors, you're going to have people that are questioning your actions, questioning your speech, and judging you. So I think the real moral is just don't make threats. Why do we have to resort to threats in the first place?
All right. Ari, did you have a response to that?
Sure. Well, no one is saying that threats can't be reacted to with violence. I'm not saying that in any way. I think we're just disagreeing about what constitutes a threat and what doesn't. I did happen to look up the definition of coercion while you were talking, though, and it is specifically the practice of persuading someone by using force or threats of violence. I don't see them using coercion against their followers. I'm not aware of any slack-jawed yokel being told that if they don't get out there and march with the Nazis, they're going to be beaten to death. You also seem to imply that if you can't leave a group without there being any sort of disassociation, that it is tantamount to coercion, and I don't get your reasoning there. But the most interesting thing you said was that, punching a Nazi isn't the most egregious form of violence. I don't know, call me silly, but I don't really consider the NAP advocating some levels of violence and not advocating others. I mean, if you ask me, the NAP pretty explicitly condemns violence. It doesn't say, okay, just don't use the most egregious forms of violence, and you can say you're abiding the NAP. It's kind of an all or nothing thing, at least in regard to aggression. And that's ultimately the discussion here. I'm not saying the law isn't necessary. As far as what you said, there's nothing really for me to dispute directly, because I've already said most of it, what constitutes a threat, and I'm going to reiterate that here in a minute. But I do dispute the idea that the law has anything to do with it. It really doesn't. The law is just a reflection of social values most of the time. It's always behind, which is why it takes us a lot of effort to decriminalize homosexuality and marijuana. But yes, once upon a time, most of society was against those things, and so we had laws against them. So laws change based on the morals and values of society. They're not really necessary. What we're really talking about is morals and whether it's morally acceptable to punch a Nazi, not whether or not it's lawful. And I think that conflating it with what is legal and what is legal is muddying the waters.
Man, did you have any other comments directly responsive to that? Or Ari, you still had a few minutes left on your rebuttal.
Oh, shit, I wasn't even doing that.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So I was just replying to what he said.
Okay, no worries. Matt, do you have a response to that first before she starts her rebuttal?
I think you're right. But
Matt?
Yeah, so, sorry. That was my bad. I had it on mute.
That was my bad. I wasn't supposed to do what I did.
No, I do agree that, and I think we both agree on this, that the law really does conflate it when we start looking at those terms. But I don't think the NAP expressly says against when violence is deemed necessary or not. I think all it says is the initiation of aggression, and coercion is in it, and you have that right to defend yourself. So I think it really it's one, it's personal, how you define that for yourself. And two, it's going to be society who deems how you use that right of yours to defend yourself, and they may deem it to be too much. They may be finding it acceptable and in agreement with you. So that's an individual thing, and it's a risk you're going to take with any action in life. Is society judging you?
Okay, Arias. So you kind of started the rebuttal before, but now you can have the full time.
Yeah, sorry about that. And
no
then,
worries.
cross-examined the way I just did him. My bad. Okay. Ultimately, this debate isn't about whether or not self-defense is acceptable. It's a debate about what constitutes self-defense. And there are two parts of my argument. And it's basically that we do have objective criteria that we use to determine this. It's not something for each individual to determine for themselves. Sure, they can, but when they do that, when they use their own definitions of what is aggression and what is self-defense, they're going to end up being the aggressors. Such as if Bob was to attack Jim. Hold on. I didn't write that down correctly. Okay, let's say Bob kills Jim and Bob attacks Jim and Jim says that it was in self-defense. Matt would gladly presumes Bob's guilt as long as Jim states that he was afraid. When I discussed this with him, he actually asked me if I was afraid of the neo-Nazis in Charlottesville, to which I replied that my emotional responses are irrelevant to whether or not a threat actually exists. And I think that's the disagreement that we're having, is that there's too much personal judgment going into Matt's decision instead of looking at the actual criteria, removing yourself from the situation, removing your emotions, removing your fear, and saying, is there actually a threat here? Because it's a dangerous mentality. It creates a dangerous world where it's not a reasonable belief that a threat is real that constitutes an act of defense, but the emotional state and the fragility of the person who is afraid. After all, as I said earlier, millions of Americans are terrified of North Korea. If our emotions dictate reality in the way that you suggest, then dropping nuclear weapons on North Korea because we're afraid of them is an act of self-defense. I dispute that entirely. One does not have the right to not be afraid, because whether or not a person is afraid, it depends entirely on their own internal emotional state. Maybe I'm a twitchy coward. Maybe I'm paranoid. Maybe I'm always jumping at shadows. It's also true that millions of Americans are terrified of Russia, of ISIS, of Al-Qaeda, and of countless other gremlins that have been put before us. Antifa, Nazis, gay people, you name it. You name it, and someone is afraid of it, and someone wants to destroy it. By this reasoning, this fear alone justifies an act of aggression as self-defense. We end up with the United States' exact foreign policy. Because we're afraid North Korea might attack us, we have to bomb them. Because we're afraid Al-Qaeda might come back, we have to stay forever in Afghanistan. Fear is the reason the federal government gave us for renewing the Patriot Act. We shouldn't let fear control more of our lives. We should restrict it so that it impacts fewer of our decisions. So what does it matter that North Korea can't possibly constitute a real threat, or that the lazy, stupid neckbeards in Charlottesville lack the organizational capabilities to drive and the ability to orchestrate any sort of genocide? What does it matter that Russia actually hasn't shown any interest in attacking the United States in decades? It doesn't matter. My fear alone justifies my actions as self-defense, even if I'm jumpy, and even if I simply escape the label of paranoid schizophrenic by a technicality. I can nuke North Korea. It's self-defense because they made a threat and I was afraid. I can declare war on Russia, and it's self-defense because they made a threat and I was afraid. My argument is that we do have objective criteria that we can and should use when we attempt to determine whether or not an act of self-defense is aggression. The emotional stability of the defendant isn't a factor. And what's most interesting about this, as I've pointed out numerous times, is that the way he words it, it does justify Nazis' fear of everybody who isn't straight white men. It justifies their genocides as self-defense. If a person's fear, regardless of whether it's reasonable, sane, or even sensible to an ordinary healthy person, is enough to justify aggression as self-defense, and that's a decision for them to make themselves, then it's a matter of whoever has the most power. Whoever gets the most people to agree with them is right. It's might is right that you're arguing. And I think you even said it yourself on Facebook, you'd gladly engage them in the field of battle. That's might is right. I don't get on board with that at all. I think that we need to stick with these objective criteria, that right is right. And it doesn't matter if the neo-Nazis manage to get tanks and nuclear bombs and they say, no, we're acting as self-defense and we're right because we have the most weapons. I don't think that's a factor. I think they're still wrong. And I think you're still wrong just because you managed to get more people to agree with you. And that's essentially what you're arguing. Fight them to the death, and whoever wins is right. No objective criteria the society has historically agreed upon. No reasoned debate, no healthy agreement and dialogue, fighting to the death. Might is right. That's the world that we face if we discard these long recognized criteria of what constitutes valid self-defense: the commission of a crime, action and the intention to act, and the ability to act. Because letting the victim's emotional state let them be afraid, it erases law, order, civility, and it replaces them with opinion against opinion, with arbitrary claim against arbitrary claim. And it moves us out of the court of reason and onto the literal battlefield where the majority rules with them because they have the most guns, because they have the most people on their side. It doesn't matter who is actually right, who is in the moral right. It only matters who has the most guns.
So Matt, you have 3 minutes for your affirmative rejoinder.
Okay. So to me, there is the slippery slope that can be made whenever we talk about giving individuals the power over their own lives, and that's why I say I think there's some levels of threat and levels of defense. So for me to view these people who are historically violent, who typically get away with violence through different means of positions of power, and also whose policies that they promote do end up getting enacted. Uh, to me, there is some level of defense, and that's why I say I think punching is pretty reasonable compared to the violence that they create. They end up creating violent state monopolies that end up killing thousands, deporting them, putting them in jails. These are racist, institutional racist policies that we have in place, and still being enacted. With the border wall, a great example right there. This is the kind of mentality it breeds. So it is a threat. For them to try to say that, well, Jews are such a threat that they have to have this government, I think that's totally unreasonable compared to a punch. I mean, if Jews are a threat, why don't they just punch them? You know what I mean? I wouldn't have any problem with that if they were just going, let's go out and punch Jews because they're a threat. I mean, I would have a problem with it, but that's a little bit better. It's a little bit more reasonable, and it's a little bit more manageable. Whereas a totalitarian fascist state with the consent of the majority is almost unstoppable without outside help. As far as our national defense and the way we conduct our foreign policy right now, I can see how Aria would make that connection and say that is kind of the slippery slope that it leads to. But that is exactly why I'm against statism, because they are using coercive money to do it. They are conscripting service to a degree. They're using predatory means of getting people to serve, and that's what I mean by forcing right now. Obviously, we don't have a draft, but these are things that we don't have any choice about. They're going to do it in our name with our money, and with our family members and neighbors. What I'm talking about is just personal empowerment, having that self-ownership to make these decisions, and also to accept the accountability that you're going to have in society for those decisions you make. And that goes for speech, and that goes for defense. So really, I think we would see less of the large-scale nuclear bomb threatening and stuff like that if we were to take it down to just protecting ourselves and those we love, decentralization, voluntary action. And you look at groups like Antifa and Redneck Revolt, where I mean these are just people who are taking matters into their own hands to provide defense for those they see threatened, including themselves.
Thanks. I think now is the time we can move into questions. We have a few questions from some of the live stream folks, so we've got one from Brian McLean, and he's asking if it's okay to punch a National Socialist. Does that mean it's okay to stab or shoot a communist? And it sounds like it's directed towards Matt, I would imagine. He didn't say, but.
And that just goes to show you that there's libertarians that believe that is an acceptable use of defensive force, killing communists. You know what I mean? And that's why I say punching seems very small on that scale. So no, I don't think you should be stabbing communists. If you're really upset and you want to teach them a lesson, you could try to punch them, I guess. They are entering you into a coercive relationship, but I'm not going to say that that's the best route.
Aria, do you have a comment on that?
I would say that they're both morally wrong. But of course, Brian knew that before he asked us why it was directed at Matt.
Right. That's why. So we got another question, also directed towards Matt as well, from Vinny Marshall. What about when a punch turns into a street fight, which turns into an all-out brawl, and that brawl turns into a murder?
I take it he's suggesting the person that threw the first punch is responsible for the whole brawl. I don't know if you can make that connection. But I mean, ultimately, what is a fight? It's two people figuring shit out. And what we're used to is an authority stepping in and saying, you aren't allowed to figure this out. We're going to figure it out for you. So I think with any ideal of a stateless society that is capable of sustaining a stateless society, there's going to be a level of virtue where these things are already somewhat contained.
So, I mean, what if I've got, I mean, just to frame the question in maybe my own way versus Vinny's, I'm not sure. But, you know, if you've got, maybe I'm carrying a weapon and I get punched because somebody feels threatened by me, and I end up shooting that other person because I feel threatened, right? Like, what is that situation?
As far as who's in the wrong, or
Right.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can make the case that both are in the wrong. Definitely. Somebody tried to challenge that dude, and that was not the guy you wanted to challenge. I'd like to know why you got hit, though.
Question for Aria. We eliminate fear for one's life. How do we justify any self-defense?
Well, one of the very first things people are trained when they're legitimately trained to use firearms is to control their fear and not shake and fire. Fear is critical to the human experience, and nobody's ever going to eliminate it. We're always going to feel it. The important thing is to not let it cloud our minds. I think Yoda said it. Fear is a path to the dark side. Fear clouds people's judgment. I mean, it does. I mean, tons of psychological research has been done on that. In the Review of General Psychology of June 1988, they released a study where it showed that confirmation bias is not just a ubiquitous phenomenon, but especially in regard to fear. It gave us, from Troy to Vietnam, war after war after war. I mean, we have studies on animals and humans that show that the amygdala, which is responsible for social behaviors and emotional behaviors in animals and in humans, when a person becomes afraid, they are far more likely to interpret strangers as threats. I mean, tons of research shows that. So it's not about, not being afraid. Everybody's afraid. Everybody's going to get afraid from time to time. The important thing is to just not let that cloud our judgments, not let it control us. So treat it like we would any other kind of emotion. Just because you get mad doesn't mean you're going to punch a wall. So just because you're afraid doesn't mean you should, whip out a gun and start shooting at shadows.
Let's see. We've got a few others here. Matt, do you also justify punching communists who advocate the use of state force against libertarians and capitalists?
Do I advocate it? No. Do I recognize that they have put you in a coercive relationship and you have a right to defend yourself? Yes. But I don't recommend it.
Is it acceptable?
Well, I think the state is an entirely different thing. I think that the state is an institution of force, violence, and coercion, that everything it does is force and violence. So, I mean, we have the right to defend ourselves against the state, whether it's a Nazi state or a socialist state or anything. I don't think Matt would disagree with that, but it's the state there that is the problem, more than what specifically it's trying to do.
Do you have any other comments, Matt? I've got another question for Aria as well.
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say, I mean, that to me, it's drawing out that accountability, and it may not be the best means, and it may get you in trouble, but somehow we have to get the American people to recognize the accountability and the consequences of these state programs they advocate for.
So another question for Aria here. You mentioned disassociation. Wouldn't that work for both sides disassociated? It seems that ethno-nationalists would want forceful removal?
I think that question may have been directed from Matt. He was the one who mentioned the disassociation and how it seemed to tie into coercion.
What are both of your guys' thoughts on that then?
Well, I'm a free association advocate all the way. I don't even care what someone's reasons are. If they don't want to associate with someone, that's their right. If they're an idiot and they choose to apply that to entire groups of people that they don't want to associate with, that's their business. It's not even their business to tell me why. I mean, if they're racist and they don't want to associate with black people or white people or Jews or whatever, that's their business. I can think it's stupid and I can choose to disassociate from them. But freedom of association all the way for me.
Where are you at on that, Matt?
Yeah, I think freedom of association is one of the strongest tools we have. And just as much as it can work against us, it can also work for us. And I think that was shown after the Unite the Right rally when you seen Chris Cantwell getting his accounts deleted and other alt-right white nationalists getting their sites taken down. That was free association, and that was no platforming, which is a strong anti-fascist stance.
See, that scares me though. I mean, white nationalist ideology, as much as I hate it, because I do, but it disappeared from the internet overnight. And we already know that the progressive left hates libertarians, and they lump us in with the alt-right all the time. I mean, what's next? I mean, they already targeted the free speech rally because it had ties to libertarianism, and they confused it with the alt-right. I mean, if we allow this precedent to be set just because and sure, GoDaddy and all of those in Google have freedom of association, but they constitute what amount to states in the digital world. And I think they should be bound by some sort of constitution or a customer agreement or something like that they're not going to get involved in that. Sure, they have the right to, just as everyone does, but I don't think it's good. And I think we're going to find in 4 more years tops that there's not a libertarian website on the internet.
Cool, guys. Anything else? Do you have any other final thoughts, parting questions, words, anything?
I'm good.
Cool.
Yeah. I do have a conclusion. Are we doing conclusions? We didn't get to that, right?
Well, you had, go for it. Yeah.
All right. Maybe I messed up. In conclusion, for me, the acts carried out from their beliefs are purposely cloaked, and I'm talking about Nazis here. I've said before, these are cowards who hide their crimes behind violent clubs and associations, who seek positions of power, like cops, judges, and prison guards. Accurate statistics are difficult to find, and because their intention is to deceive. We need to be active in opposing speech that threatens others. We need to take these words as they are, acts of coercion. There is a meaningful gap between debating politics and advocating for violence. We as libertarians do this regularly. Some of us view property theft as justifying murder. Some view voting for taxation as justification for being tossed out of a helicopter mid-flight. I view advocating for violence supremacy as cause for violence. Not so far as to say death, though, obviously. The one thing we all agree on is that there are nonviolent ways to enter someone into a coercive relationship, and government is not an effective or ethical tool to get us out of those relationships. Once that coercive relationship is established, we are justified as individuals to defend ourselves. To attempt to remove ourselves from that coercion, we can try to disassociate, but again, like it's been stated, it's not always practical or possible. One can't disassociate from a threat of a Nazi fascist government. In fact, doing nothing, you'd be allowing them to recruit people against you. And all of us who respect individualism, it's what I consider apathy. It's an absence of rational thought, accountability, and conscience, a refusal to act, which is an individual freedom. And I don't believe that in itself is an aggression. That's an individual right to not do anything about something that, even though you recognize it as a threat. But I cannot be restricted in defending myself from what I view as a clear and present danger to myself, and to others. I have that right to self-ownership to defend myself, and using alter ego rule, I do have that right to defend others. I don't believe speech should ever be a concern of the government. I don't believe there should be a government period. I believe that right resides in the individuals naturally. I believe there should be voluntary associations such as Antifa, who are volunteer-based, voluntarily funded individuals forming a defensive front. Conservatives do this too with militias and pro-life groups that sometimes have bad actors. And of course, media will exploit those bad actors. They don't want you taking their job of protecting you away. So to me, Antifa, Redneck Revolt, BLM, they are doing what responsible individuals would do in anarchy to protect their life, liberty, and property from it being stripped away by violent ethno-nationalists, and ergo anybody that actively supports those acts of violence. History has proven that threats of violent state force often aren't empty. So in the words of NoFX, the rules of anarchy camp, reckless abandonment, random acts of dumbness will be rewarded, and if you see somebody taking charge, you'll be expected to beat them. It's a very simple rule of thumb is individual accountability. You have that free speech, you have freedom to defend yourself. One is not immune from either being scrutinized by the society you live in. You have the right to speak if it's a threat. You may find yourself challenged. If somebody completely was in the wrong and punched somebody who did not make a threat whatsoever, they will be judged in the same regard. Someone may find that person's actions irresponsible and rash, and they might actually take that as a threat to them and challenge them. So we can make the slippery slope of what that leads to, but the issue at hand is whether threats of violence constitute a justification of physical defensive force. Clearly, individuals engaging in the sort of manipulation, coercion, and outright violence, such as white nationalists, as we've seen recently in Charlotte, are engaging in that initiation of force.
Thanks, Matt. Aria, do you have any comments about that, or anything before we wrap up?
Yeah, this isn't about the state. It's not about the government. It's not about state violence against people. It's about a relatively small group of idiots who want to be the state. They may be protecting. It's not even about white nationalism. Strike the white part from that entirely. Nationalism is the problem there. I don't care what color they are. Black nationalism, white nationalism, I don't really care. The state is the problem there. So yes, if we abolish the state, then we take away the power apparatus by which these people would even take away other people's property. But to say that that Antifa or whoever is protecting Jews and blacks and LGBT people's property from predation by white nationalists is just false. Their property is in far more danger of being predated by cops, judges, prison guards, senators, governors. I mean, if you want to protect people's property, those are the people you attack, not the idiots, not the powerless idiots carrying tiki torches in Charlottesville. They want the power. That's why they're marching. If they had the power, they wouldn't be marching. They'd be using it to take people's property like the state is doing already. I agree entirely that the state shouldn't be doing that. The state shouldn't exist. It shouldn't be using force. It shouldn't be using violence. It shouldn't be stealing. And if you take away all of those things, you no longer have a state. So if we get rid of that, sure, we get rid of Nazis by extension because there's nothing there for them to take control of. But the issue isn't white nationalism. The issue that Matt keeps deflecting to is the state and what the state can do. This has nothing to do with that. It has to do with whether or not these idiots calling themselves Nazis are even capable of taking people's property. And they're not. They don't control the state. They don't even control Mississippi. And this is where they're most numerous. And here I am, openly trans and the chair of the Libertarian Party of Tate County, and fuck them. They don't have any power. Thanks,
Aria. Yeah, I think that should do it, you guys. I really appreciate it. I learned a lot. I hope other folks did too. Leave some questions, thoughts, and other things in the comments section below, and we'll be happy to field them. Aria, I hope you'll be able to take a glance at them afterwards too. That would be cool.
Looking forward to it.
And yeah, we'll go from there. Thank you guys.
Thanks.
Thanks, man. Thanks, Aria.
Thanks.
This is.